The dust settled like flour through a sieve across the main street of Copper Ridge, each grain catching the brutal August sun until the whole town shimmered like a mirage. Heat rose in waves from the wooden boardwalks, bending the air into liquid ripples that made distant figures dance like spirits. The saloon doors hung open, begging for any whisper of breeze, while horses stood patient in whatever shade they could find, tails flicking at flies that moved too slow in the oppressive warmth. Dogs had long since abandoned their usual patrol routes, instead sprawling beneath porches with tongues lolling, their sides heaving with each labored breath. Even the chickens had given up scratching in the dirt, huddling instead in whatever shadow they could claim behind rain barrels and wagon wheels. The heat was the kind that made the horizon dance, that turned distant mountains into wavering phantoms, that sucked the moisture from a man's mouth before he could swallow. At the far end of town, where the last building gave way to endless prairie, a lone figure approached on foot. The man walked with purpose despite the heat, his boots raising small puffs of dirt with each step that hung in the still air like tiny dust devils before settling back to earth. His clothes were simple but well made, dark trousers that had once been crisp but now clung to his legs with perspiration, and a white shirt rolled to the elbows, darkened with sweat beneath the arms and across the back. A leather vest hung unbuttoned against the temperature, its brass buttons too hot to touch. Dust had settled into every crease of fabric, every line of his weathered face, until he seemed carved from the very earth he traveled. The man's hat, a simple brown felt affair with a wide brim, cast a shadow that barely protected his eyes from the glare. Beneath it, his hair was dark with moisture, despite the dry heat that surrounded him. His jaw was set with determination, but his lips were cracked from thirst, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had been walking longer than was wise in such conditions. Yet he pressed on, each step deliberate, as if driven by something more powerful than comfort or common sense. Jeremiah Kane had been walking for 3 days through landscape that seemed determined to break any man foolish enough to challenge it on foot. His water had run out that morning, the last precious drops consumed just after dawn, when the sun was still low enough to provide the illusion of mercy. His horse, a reliable mare named Patience, who had carried him faithfully from Denver, had thrown a shoe 20 miles back on a stretch of rocky ground that would have challenged even the most experienced farrier. He'd been forced to leave her with a sympathetic rancher who'd promised to care for her until Jeremiah could return, though both men knew that might never happen. The few coins remaining in his pocket wouldn't stretch to both a room and a new mount, barely enough for one night's shelter if he was careful, but he carried something more valuable than gold or silver in the weathered saddlebags slung over his shoulder, papers that could change everything if he could find the right person to show them to. Documents that had cost him 3 years of his life to gather, 3 years of traveling from courthouse to courthouse, following trails that often led nowhere, chasing ghosts and rumors and half-remembered stories told by old men in saloons who might or might not have been telling the truth. The weight of those papers seemed to increase with each step, not because they were heavy, but because of what they represented. Justice delayed was justice denied, the lawyers said. But what about justice that had never existed at all? What about wrongs so old that most people assumed they had been forgotten, forgiven by time itself? The town watched him approach with the lazy attention of people too hot to be truly curious. A few men lounged outside the general store, their chairs tilted back against the building's wall, whittling and spitting tobacco juice into the dust with the practiced aim of long experience. Their conversation had died away as the heat intensified, replaced by the rhythmic scrape of knives against wood and the occasional ping of brown juice hitting dirt. Women peered from behind curtains, fanning themselves with whatever came to hand, folded newspapers, turkey feathers, or simply the hem of their aprons. Children who might normally run to investigate a stranger stayed pressed against shaded walls, panting like puppies, their usual energy sapped by the relentless sun. The town itself bore the hallmarks of a place that had grown too quickly around the promise of easy money. Buildings stood at odd angles to each other, as if each had been built without regard to its neighbors, creating a maze of alleyways and dead ends that trapped heat like a series of ovens. Some structures were well built, with proper foundations and straight walls, while others looked as though they might collapse if the wind ever decided to blow. The boardwalks were uneven, some sections raised higher than others, creating a landscape of steps and gaps that could trip the unwary, especially in the harsh light that created deceptive shadows everywhere. Paint peeled from most of the buildings, revealing the gray, weathered wood beneath. The few attempts at decoration, flower boxes and painted signs, had long since surrendered to the climate. Only the saloon and the hotel showed signs of regular maintenance, their paint fresher, their windows cleaner, their boardwalks swept free of the dust that accumulated everywhere else like a persistent plague. Jeremiah paused at the edge of the boardwalk, his legs unsteady after days of walking on uneven ground. The transition from dirt to wood felt strange under his feet, the planks warm even through his thick boot soles. He studied the painted signs that hung above various establishments, some freshly painted, others so faded that their messages were barely legible. Miller's Mercantile proclaimed itself in bold red letters, though the paint had begun to crack and peel at the edges. The Silver Dollar Saloon announced its presence with an elaborate sign featuring a painting of a coin that had once been silver, but now looked more like weathered gray. Henderson's Hotel and Boarding House presented itself with simple black letters on a white background, practical and unpretentious, suggesting a place more concerned with function than appearance. None of these establishments would serve his immediate purpose, though he would need at least one of them before the day was through. He needed the man who owned the largest spread in the valley, the one whose cattle grazed for miles in every direction across land that stretched beyond the horizon, whose word carried weight not just in local matters, but in territorial courts where real decisions were made. A man whose name was spoken with a mixture of respect and fear, depending on who was doing the speaking and what business they had with him. But finding such a man was not simply a matter of asking directions. Men like that did not advertise their whereabouts, did not maintain offices on main streets where any stranger could walk in unannounced. They had to be approached carefully, through proper channels, with appropriate respect for their position and power. And Jeremiah, dusty and broke and desperate, was hardly in a position to command such respect. "You looking for someone, mister?" The voice belonged to a boy, maybe 12 years old, all knees and elbows and sun-bleached hair that stuck out in every direction, despite his mother's obvious attempts to tame it with water and whatever pomade the family could afford. He sat in the precious shade of a water trough, a fishing line dangling hopefully into the murky depths where hardy fish might survive despite the heat and the questionable quality of the water. The boy's clothes were patched and faded but clean, his feet bare and brown from the sun, his face open with the frank curiosity of youth, unburdened by the wariness that age and disappointment inevitably brought. The fishing line led to a pole that was clearly homemade, a branch cut from some long-suffering tree and sanded smooth by patient hands, probably the boy's own father working by lamplight after long days of labor. A simple hook hung from the end of a length of string that had seen better days, and beside the boy sat a rusty can filled with what appeared to be worms dug from whatever soft earth could still be found in this parched landscape. "I'm looking for Virgil Ashford," Jeremiah said, his voice rough from dust and thirst, and 3 days without much conversation beyond the occasional word to his horse before she'd gone lame. The words came out like sandpaper, and he had to clear his throat and try again to make them intelligible. The boy's eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been concern. In a small town, everyone knew who everyone else was, and more importantly, everyone knew who they were supposed to be afraid of. The boy's reaction told Jeremiah that Ashford was definitely the latter category. "Old man Ashford? What you want with him?" The question carried the weight of genuine worry, as if the boy were asking why anyone would voluntarily seek out danger, like asking why someone might want to poke a sleeping rattlesnake with a stick. Business. The boy studied him with the frank assessment of youth that saw through pretense and polish to the core of what a person really was. He took in Jeremiah's dust-covered clothes, his cracked lips, the way he swayed slightly from exhaustion and dehydration, and seemed to weigh all of this against whatever errand might bring a stranger to the most powerful man in the county. "You don't look like you got business with someone like him." "No offense, mister." The observation stung because it was accurate. Jeremiah looked like exactly what he was. A man at the end of his resources, carrying nothing but determination and a leather portfolio full of papers that might or might not be worth the effort it had taken to gather them. Jeremiah managed a tired smile. None taken. How do I find him? Big white house on the hill north of town. Can't miss it. The boy paused. But he don't see just anybody. Keeps to himself mostly, except when he comes to town for supplies. When does he do that? Saturdays usually. Today's Friday. Jeremiah looked up at the sun, still high and merciless. He had enough strength left for one more walk, but not in this heat. He'd have to wait, find shade, conserve what little he had left. Much obliged, he told the boy, and began walking toward the hotel. The lobby of Henderson's was barely cooler than the street, thick air stirring lazily under the push of palm fans wielded by two women behind the desk. The older woman looked up as he entered, her expression neutral but assessing. "Need a room?" she asked. "Just for tonight. Cheapest you have." She named a price that would leave him with exactly enough for a meal, nothing more. He nodded and signed the register with careful script. The pen felt foreign in his dust-caked fingers. "Room 6, upstairs. Meals extra." Understood. The room was small, stifling, with a single window that faced west toward the afternoon sun like a portal to hell itself. The glass was so thick with dust that it barely allowed light through, though what did make it past was concentrated and focused like a magnifying glass, making the air shimmer with heat. But the space contained the one thing Jeremiah needed most in the world at that moment. A bed. Not a comfortable bed, not a clean bed, just a horizontal surface where he could finally allow his body to rest after 3 days of punishment. The mattress was thin, stuffed with what felt like corn husks and straw that crackled with every movement, covered by a sheet that had once been white, but had faded to the color of old parchment. The pillow was little more than a sack filled with feathers that had long since lost their loft, creating a lumpy mass that would provide minimal comfort for his aching head. But after sleeping on the ground for days, it looked like luxury. Jeremiah set his saddlebags carefully beside the washstand, a simple wooden structure that held a chipped porcelain basin and a pitcher that contained perhaps 2 cups of warm water. The mirror above it was cracked in one corner, creating a spider web of reflected images that made his already haggard appearance seem even more fragmented and desperate. He caught sight of himself for the first time in days and was shocked by what he saw. A man who looked more like a drifter than someone with legitimate business to conduct. From his bags, he withdrew the leather portfolio that had been his constant companion for 3 years, its edges worn smooth from handling, its leather darkened with sweat and weather, and the oils from his hands. The brass clasps that held it closed were tarnished green, but they still functioned perfectly, protecting the contents that had cost him everything to acquire. Inside were documents that most people would consider worthless. Old papers, faded ink, signatures from people long dead. But to Jeremiah, they represented the difference between justice and injustice, between truth and lies, between honoring the dead and forgetting them entirely. He spread them on the bed with the care of a priest, handling sacred relics, checking each one again though he knew their contents by heart. Land surveys that showed boundaries drawn with mathematical precision, marking out sections and townships according to the territorial grid system that had been imposed upon the landscape like a giant checkerboard. Territorial records that documented claims and counterclaims, disputes over water rights and grazing privileges, the complicated legal machinery that was supposed to ensure that land ownership proceeded in an orderly fashion. Witness statements from people who had been there when the original settlements were established, who could testify to who had lived where and for how long, who had built what and claimed which parcels of earth as their own. And most important of all, a deed that most people believed had been destroyed in a courthouse fire 40 years earlier. Its existence known only to a few old-timers who had been dismissed as senile or confused when they claimed to remember such a document. The paper was brown with age, brittle at the edges, and the ink had faded to a light brown that was barely legible in some places. But the words were still there, the legal language that established ownership as clearly as any modern document, more clearly perhaps because it had been written in a time when such things mattered more than political connections or economic power. Somewhere in this valley, beneath the summer grass that waved in whatever breeze could stir in the oppressive heat, beneath the wildflowers that bloomed in defiance of the drought, lay the bones of a town that had existed before Copper Ridge, before the cattle barons had carved up the territory like a pie and distributed the pieces among themselves. A town called Haven Springs, populated by freed slaves and poor whites, who had claimed their little piece of earth fair and square, following all the proper procedures, filing all the necessary papers, paying all the required fees. They had been farmers mostly, people who understood that the land had to be coaxed and cajoled into productivity, that it required patience and knowledge and back-breaking labor to make it yield crops that could sustain human life. They had built homes and schools and churches, had established a post office and a general store, had created the basic infrastructure of civilization in a place where none had existed before. They had been citizens in the fullest sense of the word, contributing to the tax base, participating in territorial politics, sending their children to school and their young men to serve in the militia when called upon. Until the drought of 1871, until the cattle started dying, until powerful men decided that empty land belonged to whoever could take it. Empty land, as if the graves of their children and elders were nothing, as if the sweat they had poured into the soil for decades counted for nothing, as if their dreams and hopes and struggles were less real than the desires of men with more money and fewer scruples. Jeremiah's grandfather had been the sheriff of Haven Springs, a man named Amos Kane, who had kept the peace and protected the settlers until the very end. The deed in Jeremiah's hands bore his grandfather's name, along with 47 others. 47 families who had lost everything when their town was erased from maps and memory. But Virgil Ashford remembered. Ashford had been there, a young man then, working for the cattle syndicate that had waited for the last resident to die or leave before claiming the land. Now he owned 20,000 acres of the richest grazing land in the territory, land that had never legally been his to take. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He gathered the papers quickly, sliding them back into the portfolio. "Yes? Thought you might be thirsty." The voice was young, female, carrying the kind of concern that suggested genuine kindness, rather than mere politeness. He opened the door to find a girl of perhaps 16, holding a pitcher of water that beaded with condensation, and a glass that looked mercifully clean. She was pretty in the wholesome way of frontier daughters, with brown hair braided back in a practical style that kept it away from her face while she worked, and a simple calico dress that had been mended more than once but with such skill that the repairs were barely noticeable. The fabric was faded from repeated washing but clean and pressed, suggesting a young woman who took pride in her appearance despite limited means. But it was her eyes that struck him most forcefully, dark and knowing, as if she saw more than most people twice her age. There was intelligence there, and compassion, and a maturity that spoke of someone who had been forced to grow up quickly in a place where childhood was a luxury few could afford. Her hands, he noticed, were calloused from work, but her movements were graceful, suggesting someone who had been taught proper manners, even if she rarely had occasion to use them. "I'm Abigail," she said, setting the pitcher down on his washstand and filling the glass with water that looked cleaner and cooler than anything he had seen in days. "My ma runs the hotel. Figured you looked about done in when you came through." The water was indeed cool, despite the heat that seemed to penetrate everything else in the building. She must have kept it in the coolest part of the hotel, perhaps a root cellar or spring house that provided some relief from the oppressive temperature. The first sip was like a benediction, soothing his parched throat and providing the first real comfort he had experienced since leaving Denver. "That's kind of you." He accepted the glass gratefully, draining it in long swallows that made his throat work convulsively as he tried to replace some of the moisture his body had lost during the long walk. The water was warm but sweet, tasting faintly of minerals that suggested it came from a deep well, the best thing he'd tasted in days. It settled in his stomach like a blessing, beginning the slow process of rehydrating his abused body. She refilled the glass without being asked, her movements economical and practiced, suggesting someone who was accustomed to caring for guests who arrived in various states of distress. "You really going to see Mr. Ashford? Word travels fast in a small town?" "Everything travels fast here. Not much else to talk about." She leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "Most people who want to see him, he wants to see them first. You might be waiting a while." "I'll wait as long as it takes." Something in his tone made her straighten. "Must be important business." "It is." She nodded as if she understood, though she couldn't possibly know what he carried. "Well, if you need anything else, just holler. Supper's at 6 if you've got the money for it." After she left, Jeremiah returned to the window, looking out at the dusty street below. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the ruins of Haven Springs, marked now only by a few foundation stones and a cemetery overgrown with prairie grass. But those graves deserved better than to be forgotten. The families who had scraped together their life savings to claim that land deserved justice, even if it came 40 years too late. He would wait. He would face Virgil Ashford with the truth, no matter what it cost him. Night brought little relief from the heat. Jeremiah lay on top of the thin blanket, listening to the sounds of the town settling into restless sleep. Voices drifted from the saloon, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the tinkling of piano keys. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, then fell quiet. He must have dozed, because the next thing he knew, gray light was seeping through the window, and roosters were crowing in backyards across town. Saturday, the day Virgil Ashford came to town. Jeremiah rose stiffly, splashed water on his face from the basin, and checked his appearance in the spotted mirror. He looked like what he was, a man who had traveled far on little money, but his eyes were clear and his hands steady. That would have to be enough. Downstairs, the hotel dining room was nearly empty. A traveling salesman picked at eggs and beans at one table, while two cowboys nursed coffee and talked in low voices about weather and cattle prices. Jeremiah ordered coffee and bread, all he could afford, and positioned himself where he could watch the street. Ashford arrived at precisely 9 o'clock. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking him. He rode in a black carriage pulled by matched bay horses, dust swirling behind him like a personal storm. The conveyance was expensive, well-maintained, a declaration of prosperity in a land where most people considered themselves lucky to own a saddle horse. As the carriage pulled up in front of the Mercantile, Jeremiah got his first clear look at the man he had come so far to confront. Virgil Ashford was in his 60s now, his hair gone white but still thick, his beard neatly trimmed. He wore a dark suit despite the heat, with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. When he stepped down from the carriage, he moved with the careful dignity of a man conscious of his position in the world. Jeremiah finished his coffee, left his few remaining coins on the table, and walked outside. The morning heat was already building, but it would be hours before it reached the crushing intensity of the afternoon. Jeremiah crossed the street, his portfolio tucked securely under his arm, and took up position outside the Mercantile. He didn't have long to wait. Ashford emerged from the store, followed by a clerk carrying packages. He was directing the placement of supplies in his carriage when he noticed Jeremiah watching him. "You have business with me?" Ashford's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I do, sir." "If you could spare a few minutes?" Ashford studied him with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "You're not from around here?" "No, sir. I've come from Denver. Long way to travel for conversation." "What's your name?" "Jeremiah Kane." If the name meant anything to Ashford, he didn't show it. "And what is the nature of your business, Mr. Kane?" Jeremiah glanced around at the people within earshot. A conversation like this required privacy. "It concerns land ownership in this valley, specifically the area known as Haven Springs." For just an instant, Ashford's composure slipped. His eyes narrowed, and his hand tightened on his walking stick. Then the mask was back in place, smooth as polished marble. "I'm not familiar with that name." "I think you are, sir, and I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Ashford was quiet for a long moment, weighing options. Finally, he nodded toward his carriage. "Very well. We'll discuss this at my home. Climb in." The ride to Ashford's house took 20 minutes through rolling hills dotted with cattle. The land was beautiful, rich grassland that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jeremiah tried not to think about what it had cost to acquire all this wealth, about the families who had been displaced to make room for these endless herds. The house itself was impressive, a 2-story structure of white-painted wood with a wraparound porch and tall windows designed to catch whatever breeze might stir in the summer heat. Gardens surrounded it, kept green by an elaborate system of irrigation channels that spoke of serious money and determination. Inside, the house was cool and dim, heavy curtains blocking the sun. Ashford led him to a study lined with books and maps, gesturing to a leather chair across from an imposing desk. "Now then," Ashford said, settling into his own chair, "what exactly do you think you know about Haven Springs?" Jeremiah opened his portfolio and withdrew the deed, placing it carefully on the desk. "I know that my grandfather, Amos Kane, owned 40 acres there, along with 46 other families who had legal claims to the land." Ashford picked up the document, examining it with the care of a man who knew his way around legal papers. "This appears to be authentic." "It is authentic. It's also one of the few records that survived the courthouse fire. The same fire that destroyed all the other deeds, all the surveys, all the official records that might have complicated later land claims. Fires happen, Mr. Kane, especially in wooden buildings during drought years. This fire was convenient. It happened 3 days after the last resident of Haven Springs died, 3 days before a certain cattle syndicate filed claims on the abandoned land." Ashford set the deed down carefully. "You're suggesting arson." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts." Jeremiah withdrew more documents from his portfolio. Witness statements, survey records from the territorial office, a letter from the territorial governor's office questioning the validity of the land grab. All of this is 40 years in the past. Theft doesn't have a statute of limitations, Mr. Ashford. Not when it involves this much land, this much money. Ashford leaned back in his chair, studying Jeremiah with new attention. "What is it you want?" "Money. I want what's right. Those families were cheated out of their homes, their futures. Some of them have children still living, grandchildren who never got their inheritance." "And you propose to do what exactly?" "Sue me? Take me to court with 40-year-old papers?" "If necessary." Ashford laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mr. Kane, do you have any idea who you're threatening? I own half this county. I have friends in the territorial legislature, judges who owe their positions to my support. You're a man with no money, no connections, no influence. What makes you think anyone will listen to you?" "Because I'm not the only one who knows the truth. These documents have been copied, filed with attorneys in Denver and Santa Fe. If anything happens to me, if I simply disappear, other people will ask questions." For the first time since they'd begun talking, Ashford looked genuinely concerned. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You've thought this through?" "I've had 3 years to think it through." 3 years. That's a long time to nurse a grudge. It's not about grudges. It's about justice. Ashford turned back to face him. "Justice. A fine word. But justice doesn't put food on the table, Mr. Kane. It doesn't pay for clothes or shelter or medicine. What I built here, what I accomplished, it brought prosperity to this entire valley. Jobs for cowboys and shopkeepers and farmers. A reason for towns like Copper Ridge to exist at all. Built on stolen land. built on empty land that nobody was using. Empty because you waited for everyone to die or leave. The two men stared at each other across the room, 40 years of history hanging between them like smoke. Outside, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, oblivious to human complications. "Suppose," Ashford said finally, "just suppose I were willing to discuss some form of compensation. What would you consider fair?" "I'd consider the return of the land to be fair." "That's impossible. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't simply hand over 20,000 acres. I have debts, obligations, employees who depend on this ranch for their livelihoods." "Then we'll have to find another solution." "Such as?" Jeremiah had been preparing for this moment for months. Compensation to the surviving families, enough to buy land elsewhere, to start over, and a public acknowledgement of what happened at Haven Springs. A memorial, perhaps. Something to ensure the town isn't completely forgotten. How much compensation? $50,000. Ashford's eyebrows rose. That's a considerable sum. It's a fraction of what this land is worth. You know it, and I know it. Even if I agreed, which I'm not saying I am, how would I know this would end the matter? How would I know you wouldn't come back for more, or find new reasons to cause trouble? You'd have my word. The word of a man I've known for 1 hour. The word of Amos Kane's grandson. Something in the way Jeremiah said it made Ashford pause. You really knew him? Your grandfather. I lived with him until I was 12. He told me stories about Haven Springs, about the good people who lived there, about the sheriff who tried to protect them, even when he knew it was hopeless. Amos was a good man, Ashford said quietly. Stubborn as a mule and honest as the day is long. I respected him, even when we disagreed. Then honor his memory. Do what's right. Ashford walked back to his desk, picked up the deed, and studied it again. I need time to consider this. It's not a decision I can make lightly. How much time? A week, maybe 2. I don't have 2 weeks. I'm nearly out of money, and I can't afford to stay in town indefinitely. Then perhaps we can come to a temporary arrangement. Ashford opened a drawer and withdrew a leather purse. Enough to keep you comfortable while I consider your proposal. Jeremiah looked at the money but didn't reach for it. I'm not asking for charity. Consider it an investment in good faith. If we reach an agreement, it can be deducted from whatever settlement we arrange. If not, consider it compensation for your time and trouble. It was a reasonable offer, perhaps more reasonable than Jeremiah had expected. But something about it troubled him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. I'll need those documents back, Ashford said, to have my lawyers examine them properly. I'll provide copies. The originals stay with me, as you wish. Ashford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'll have someone drive you back to town. We'll talk again in a few days. The ride back to Copper Ridge was quiet. Jeremiah found himself studying the driver, a weathered man in his 40s who handled the horses with easy competence. When they reached the hotel, the man helped him down from the carriage without comment. Much obliged, Jeremiah said. The man touched his hat brim. Welcome, mister. You take care of yourself now. There was something in his tone, a warning perhaps, that made Jeremiah look back as the carriage pulled away. But the driver was already focused on his horses, and the moment passed. Back in his stifling hotel room, Jeremiah counted the money Ashford had given him. More than enough for another week, possibly 2 if he was careful. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the whole encounter. Ashford had been too reasonable, too willing to consider compromise. Men didn't build empires by being reasonable. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Abigail again, this time carrying a tray with a plate of food. Ma thought you might be hungry, she said. Saw you come back from the Ashford place. That's kind of her. What do I owe you? Nothing. Ma says a man's got to eat. He accepted the tray gratefully. The plate held beef stew, fresh bread, and vegetables, more food than he'd seen at one time in days. "Mind if I ask how your meeting went?" Abigail settled into the room's single chair, as if she belonged there. "Well enough, I suppose. He's considering my proposal. That's something, anyway. Most folks don't get that far with Virgil Ashford." "You know him well?" "Well, as anybody in town, I guess. He's not what you'd call sociable, but he's always been fair in his dealings. Pays his bills on time, doesn't cause trouble." "What about 40 years ago? Were you born here?" "Born and raised. But I wouldn't know much about 40 years back. That'd be before my time by quite a stretch." "What about your parents? Do they remember the old days?" Abigail's expression grew cautious. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about the history of the area, trying to understand how things developed." "Well, my pa might remember some. He's been here since he was young, but he doesn't talk much about the old days. Says there's no point looking backwards when you got enough troubles looking forward." "Smart man. He has his moments." She stood to go. "You enjoy that stew now, and if you need anything else, just holler." After she left, Jeremiah ate slowly, savoring each bite. The stew was excellent, rich with beef and vegetables, seasoned with herbs that suggested someone who knew their way around a kitchen. But even as he ate, his mind kept returning to Ashford's offer. $50,000 was a lot of money, more than most people saw in a lifetime. But was it enough to balance the scales of justice? And could he trust Ashford to honor any agreement they might reach? The afternoon heat was reaching its peak when Jeremiah decided to walk around town despite the temperature. He needed to think, and the hotel room felt too much like a cage. The streets were nearly empty, most sensible people having retreated to whatever shade they could find. Even the dogs had given up and lay panting in doorways. He found himself at the edge of town, where the last building gave way to open prairie. Somewhere out there, beneath the summer grass, lay the remains of Haven Springs, his grandfather's town, his heritage. Hot day for a walk. Jeremiah turned to find a man approaching, someone he hadn't seen before. Middle-aged, well-dressed, but not ostentatiously so, with the kind of face that suggested he knew how to keep other people's secrets. "I'm used to it," Jeremiah said. "Name's Eli Patterson. I'm what passes for a lawyer in these parts." "Jeremiah Kane. I know who you are." Word gets around. Patterson moved into what little shade a scrub oak provided. "Heard you had an interesting conversation with Virgil Ashford today." News travels fast. It does when it involves the biggest landowner in the county. "Mind if I ask what you discussed?" Jeremiah studied the man carefully. "Legal matters, private ones." "Of course. I wouldn't expect you to share details." Patterson smiled. "But I might be able to offer some advice, if you're interested." "What kind of advice?" "The kind that might keep you from making a costly mistake." "Such as?" Patterson glanced around, though they were alone on the prairie. "Virgil Ashford is a powerful man. He's been here a long time, put down deep roots. He doesn't like being challenged, and he has ways of dealing with people who cause him problems." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Patterson?" "Quite the opposite. I'm trying to help you. Whatever business you have with Ashford, I'd suggest you conclude it quickly and move on. This isn't a healthy place for strangers who ask uncomfortable questions." "And if I don't?" Patterson shrugged. "Accidents happen, people disappear. It's a big territory, and the law can only protect you if it knows you need protecting." "The law should protect everyone equally." "Should. Yes, it should. But this is the real world, Mr. Kane, not a philosophy classroom. In the real world, money talks and poor men listen." "What if the poor man has something money can't buy?" "Such as?" "The truth." Patterson laughed, but not unkindly. "The truth is a luxury most people can't afford. I've seen plenty of men with the truth on their side. Most of them are buried in unmarked graves." Then why are you warning me? Because I knew your grandfather. Amos Kane was a good man who tried to do right by everyone. He deserved better than he got. You were there? At Haven Springs? I was young then, just starting out as a lawyer. I helped some of the families with their land claims, tried to make sure everything was legal and proper. Patterson's expression grew distant. Fat lot of good it did them in the end. What really happened? After the drought, I mean. What happened was patience. Ashford and his partners knew they couldn't just take the land while people were still living on it. Too many witnesses, too much chance of territorial intervention, so they waited. They offered to buy people out for far less than the land was worth. When that didn't work, they found other ways to encourage people to leave. What kind of ways? Cattle drives that happened to pass through crop fields, wells that mysteriously went dry, supply wagons that never quite made it to town. Nothing you could prove in court, but enough to make life difficult for anyone stubborn enough to stay. My grandfather stayed. Amos stayed until the very end. He knew what was happening, but he couldn't prove it and couldn't stop it. When the last family pulled out, he finally gave up. Died 6 months later, some say of a broken heart. And then the courthouse burned, 3 days after Amos died. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Jeremiah was quiet for a moment, absorbing the implications. Why are you telling me this? Because you have a right to know what you're up against. And because maybe, just maybe, you've got something the rest of us didn't. Which is distance, time, the ability to see this whole mess from the outside. Patterson turned to go. But be careful, Mr. Kane. Virgil Ashford didn't get where he is by being sentimental about the past. That evening, Jeremiah sat on the hotel's front porch, trying to catch whatever breeze might stir in the cooling air. The sun was finally setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. Abigail emerged from the hotel carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed him one without comment and settled into the chair beside him. Thought you might be thirsty. Seems like you're always feeding me or giving me something to drink. I appreciate the kindness. Ma says hospitality is the least we can offer a stranger. She sipped her lemonade thoughtfully. Besides, you look like a man carrying a heavy load. Do I? You've got that look. Same one my pa gets when he's wrestling with something he can't quite solve. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town settle into evening routines. A few people moved along the boardwalks, heading home from work or stepping out for supper. Lamplight began to flicker in windows as families gathered around dinner tables. "Can I ask you something?" Abigail said finally. "Of course." "That business you have with Mr. Ashford, is it the kind that might get you hurt?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that it caught him off guard. "Why would you think that?" "Because Eli Patterson came by this afternoon asking about you. And Eli doesn't ask questions unless there's trouble brewing." "What kind of questions?" "How long you plan to stay? Whether you seemed like the kind of man who might cause problems. Ma told him you were quiet and polite and minded your own business, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied." Jeremiah considered how much to tell her. She was young, but clearly not naive, and she seemed genuinely concerned for his welfare. "The business I have with Ashford involves something that happened a long time ago. Something that might make some people uncomfortable if it came to light. Something illegal? Something unfair, certainly. Whether it was illegal depends on how you look at the law." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Well, for what it's worth, I hope you get what you came for. But I also hope you're careful. This is a small town, and people here have long memories. They don't like change, and they especially don't like strangers who might bring trouble. I'll keep that in mind. See that you do." She stood to go inside. "And Mr. Kane, if you need help, If things get difficult, you can come to us. Ma and I, we don't hold with bullying, no matter who's doing it." After she left, Jeremiah remained on the porch, thinking about her words. In 3 days, he'd received more genuine kindness from this girl and her mother than from anyone else in recent memory. It was a reminder that good people existed everywhere, even in places where powerful men tried to control everything. But it was also a reminder of what he was risking. If his confrontation with Ashford went badly, it might not just be his own life at stake. Anyone who helped him might find themselves in danger as well. The next morning brought clouds for the first time since he'd arrived, thick gray masses that promised rain, but delivered only humid air that clung like a wet blanket. Jeremiah woke early and walked to the Mercantile, hoping to gather more information about the town's history. The store was busy despite the early hour, ranchers and farmers stocking up before the weather turned. Jeremiah browsed the shelves, listening to conversations, picking up fragments of local gossip and information. "Heard Ashford's got himself a visitor," one man was saying. "Fellow from Denver asking questions about the old days." "What kind of questions?" his companion asked. "The kind that make people nervous. Something about land ownership, way I heard it. Probably just another lawyer looking to make trouble. They're like buzzards, always circling around looking for something to pick clean." Jeremiah moved closer to a display of canned goods, pretending to read labels while he listened. "Maybe so," the first man said, "but this one's got Ashford spooked. Saw him in here yesterday, buying supplies like he was planning to be away for a while." "Away? Where would he go?" "Don't know, but he was asking about the trail north, the one that leads to the territorial capital. Seemed mighty interested in how long the journey takes." Jeremiah's blood chilled. If Ashford was planning to leave town, it could only mean one thing. He had no intention of honoring any agreement they might reach. He was buying time, perhaps arranging for some more permanent solution to the problem Jeremiah represented. He paid for a few items he didn't need and left the store, his mind racing. He needed to force Ashford's hand before the man could disappear. But how? The answer came to him as he walked back to the hotel. If Ashford was worried about exposure, about having his past crimes made public, then the threat of immediate exposure might be enough to bring him to the negotiating table. Jeremiah spent the morning writing, not a legal document or a formal complaint, but a simple narrative account of what had happened at Haven Springs. He wrote about the drought, the pressure campaign, the convenient courthouse fire, and the systematic theft of land from people who couldn't defend themselves. He wrote about his grandfather, about the other families who had lost everything, about the 40 years of silence that had followed. When he finished, he had 12 pages of clear, factual prose that told the story without embellishment or legal jargon. Anyone who read it would understand exactly what had happened and who was responsible. He made 3 copies by hand, a laborious process in the summer heat. One copy went into his portfolio with the original documents. The second he sealed in an envelope addressed to the territorial governor. The third he took to the telegraph office. "Need to send this to Denver," he told the operator, "to the Rocky Mountain News." The operator, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, looked at the thick envelope dubiously. "This is going to cost you considerable." "How much?" The man weighed the envelope, consulted his rate book, and named a figure that would take most of Jeremiah's remaining money. "Send it," Jeremiah said. "You sure? That's a lot of money for a telegram." "It's not a telegram. I want the whole envelope sent by the fastest possible means. That'd be the noon stage to Denver. Gets there tomorrow evening." "Perfect." As the operator prepared the shipment, Jeremiah wrote a brief cover letter explaining that the enclosed story would be of interest to readers throughout the territory. He wasn't sure the newspaper would print it, but the threat that they might would be enough to worry Ashford. By the time he left the telegraph office, word of his activities was already spreading through town. The operator's wife had been listening, and she wasted no time sharing the interesting news that the stranger was sending mysterious packages to Denver newspapers. Jeremiah was counting on that. By evening, Ashford would know exactly what he'd done. The question was how the cattle baron would respond. He didn't have long to wait. As he sat down to a modest supper at the hotel, Abigail appeared at his elbow with a message. "Man came by asking for you. Said to tell you Mr. Ashford would like to see you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp." "Did he say anything else?" "Just that you shouldn't keep Mr. Ashford waiting." "I won't." But as he ate his beans and cornbread, Jeremiah couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow's meeting would be very different from the first one. Ashford would no longer be the reasonable patriarch considering a compromise. He would be a cornered predator, and cornered predators were the most dangerous of all. That night, Jeremiah lay awake listening to the wind build outside his window. The promised storm was finally coming. He could feel it in the heavy air, see it in the lightning that flickered on the horizon. By morning, the weather would have changed. He only hoped he would live to see it. The storm broke just before dawn with a crack of thunder that rattled windows throughout the town. Rain came in sheets, turning the dusty streets into rivers of mud and bringing blessed relief from the heat that had gripped the valley for weeks. By the time Jeremiah made his way to Ashford's carriage at 9 o'clock, the air was cooler and cleaner than it had been since his arrival. Ashford was waiting inside the carriage, his expression unreadable. He nodded curtly as Jeremiah climbed in, water dripping from his coat. "Nasty morning," Ashford said, but his tone suggested the weather was the least of their concerns. The valley needed the rain. Yes, it did. Ashford signaled his driver, and the carriage lurched into motion. "I understand you've been busy since our last meeting." "I've been productive." "Sending packages to Denver newspapers." "That's an interesting way to negotiate." Jeremiah met his gaze steadily. "I prefer to think of it as insurance." "Insurance." Ashford smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Against what, exactly?" "Against the possibility that our negotiations might not proceed in good faith." "And you think threatening me through the press will encourage good faith?" "I think transparency encourages honesty." They rode in silence for several minutes. The only sounds the drumming of rain on the carriage roof and the squelch of wheels through mud. Outside, the landscape looked different under the gray sky, softer somehow, as if the rain had washed away the harsh edges that heat and drought had carved into the land. "Tell me," Ashford said finally, "what do you hope to accomplish with this crusade of yours?" "I told you yesterday. Justice for the families who were cheated out of their land." Justice. Ashford repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "You speak of justice as if it's something you can buy and sell, something you can demand and receive. But justice is a luxury, Mr. Kane. The luxury of people who don't have to worry about their next meal or their next mortgage payment. My grandfather worried about both those things. So did the other families in Haven Springs. They still deserve justice. Your grandfather was a dreamer, a good man, but a dreamer nonetheless. He believed that right would triumph over might, that the law would protect the weak from the strong. Experience should have taught him otherwise. Maybe, or maybe he understood something you never learned, which is that some things are worth fighting for, even when you know you'll lose." Ashford studied him with those pale blue eyes, and for a moment, Jeremiah thought he saw something like respect there, but it passed quickly, replaced by calculation. "We're here," Ashford said as the carriage rolled to a stop. But they weren't at the White House on the hill. Instead, they had stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned homestead, a collection of weathered buildings surrounded by overgrown fields. Rain dripped from sagging roof lines, and weeds grew tall around the foundations. "Where are we?" Jeremiah asked. "Haven Springs," Ashford said quietly. "What's left of it?" Jeremiah felt his breath catch. All these years, all the miles he'd traveled, and he was finally here. The place his grandfather had called home, had tried to protect, had died defending. "Come," Ashford said, stepping down from the carriage. "Let me show you what your justice looks like." They walked through the rain toward the largest of the ruined buildings, their boots squelching in the mud. What had once been the main street was now barely visible beneath decades of grass and wildflowers, but Jeremiah could still make out the outlines of foundations, the remains of what had once been a thriving community. 47 families, Ashford said, gesturing at the ruins. 47 families who tried to make a life in one of the harshest places on earth. You want to know what really killed Haven Springs? It wasn't greed or conspiracy or any of the other villains you've invented. It was the land itself. They stopped before what had once been a church, its steeple long since fallen, its walls crumbling back into the earth from which they had been built. The drought of 1871 lasted 3 years, Ashford continued. 3 years without enough rain to grow crops, without enough grass to feed cattle. Wells went dry, streams disappeared, the soil blew away in dust storms that lasted for days. People survived droughts before. Some did, others didn't. The difference was money, Mr. Kane. Money for seed when the first crop failed. Money for feed when the pastures burned. Money to drill deeper wells when the shallow ones went dry. Your grandfather and his neighbors, they were good people, honest people, but they didn't have money. Jeremiah walked to what remained of the church doorway, running his hand along the weathered wood. Inside, he could see the remnants of pews, a few fragments of colored glass that had once been windows. So you bought them out. I offered to buy them out. Fair market prices for land that was rapidly becoming worthless. Some accepted, others refused, held on longer than they should have. Until they were forced to leave. Until they realized they had no choice. The land betrayed them, Mr. Kane. Not me. And the courthouse fire? Ashford was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. The courthouse fire was an accident. A clerk knocked over a lantern while working late. These things happen in wooden buildings during dry seasons. How convenient. Yes, it was convenient, but convenience and conspiracy are not the same thing. They walked deeper into the ruins, past foundations overgrown with prairie grass, past the remains of what might once have been a schoolhouse or general store. In the distance, on a small rise, Jeremiah could see a collection of weathered stone markers. The cemetery, he said. Yes. Some of your grandfather's neighbors never left Haven Springs. They're buried here, along with their dreams. They climbed the hill slowly, rain making the grass slippery beneath their feet. The cemetery was small, perhaps 30 graves marked by simple stones or wooden crosses. Many of the markers were illegible now, their inscriptions worn away by decades of weather. But one stone stood apart from the others, larger and better preserved. Jeremiah approached it slowly, his heart pounding. Amos Kane, 1822 to 1872, sheriff and friend. Below the inscription in smaller letters, he stood when others fell. Jeremiah knelt beside the grave, unmindful of the mud soaking through his trousers. He had carried an image of his grandfather in his memory for so many years, but being here, at his final resting place, made the loss feel fresh again. I paid for the stone, Ashford said quietly. After he died, it seemed the least I could do. Why? Jeremiah's voice was thick with emotion. If you respected him so much, why didn't you help him when he was alive? Because helping him would have meant destroying myself. And I wasn't that noble. Jeremiah stood slowly, facing the older man. You could be that noble now. Could I? And what would be the point? Your grandfather is dead, Mr. Kane. So are most of the people who lived here. The few who survived have built new lives elsewhere. What purpose would it serve to dredge up old grievances now? It would serve the purpose of truth. Truth. Ashford laughed bitterly. The truth is that I was young and ambitious and desperate to succeed. The truth is that I saw an opportunity and took it. just as thousands of other young men were doing all across the frontier. The truth is that I built something good from something tragic, and I've spent 40 years trying to convince myself that the ends justified the means. And have you? Convinced yourself? Ashford looked out over the valley spread below them, his valley now, green and prosperous even in the rain. Some days, but not today. They stood in silence for several minutes, two men separated by decades of history, but united in their understanding of what this place represented. Finally, Ashford turned to go. "Come, there's something else I want to show you." They walked back down the hill to where the driver waited with the carriage. But instead of climbing in, Ashford led Jeremiah to a small building that had been partially restored, its roof patched and its walls reinforced. "What is this?" Jeremiah asked. "Storage, mostly." But also, Ashford produced a key and unlocked the door. "A place where I keep things that matter." Inside, the building was dry and well organized. Shelves lined the walls, holding boxes and files and artifacts from another time. But it was the far wall that drew Jeremiah's attention. Mounted there were dozens of photographs, some faded with age, showing the faces of people he didn't recognize but somehow knew. "The families of Haven Springs," Ashford explained. "I had a photographer come through in 1870 before the drought hit. Most of them probably forgot they'd ever posed for these pictures." Jeremiah moved closer, studying the faces. Men and women and children who had bet everything on their ability to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. They looked proud, hopeful, unaware of what was coming. And this. Ashford pulled a thick ledger from one of the shelves. "Every transaction, every offer I made, every negotiation. Some sold willingly, others held out until the very end. Your grandfather was one of the last." Jeremiah opened the ledger, scanning the entries. The amounts were there, carefully recorded, along with notes about each family's circumstances. It painted a picture of systematic acquisition, but also of fair dealing within the context of the times. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand that your crusade for justice isn't as simple as you think." "Yes, I benefited from their misfortune, but I didn't create that misfortune, and I didn't force anyone to sell who wasn't already desperate. But you were willing to wait until they were desperate." "Yes, I was willing to wait." Ashford closed the ledger and returned it to the shelf. "The question now is what we do with this knowledge. You've threatened to expose me, to drag me through the newspapers and the courts. You could probably succeed. I'm an old man now, and I have more to lose than to gain from a public fight. Then you'll accept my terms?" "I might. But first, I want to make you a different offer." They walked outside, where the rain was beginning to ease. Patches of blue sky showed through the breaking clouds, and the sun sent long shafts of light across the valley. $50,000, as you requested," Ashford said, "but not as compensation to families who are mostly dead or scattered, as seed money for something new." "What do you mean?" "I mean a school. Here, on this site. A place where children from all over the territory can come to learn, regardless of their family's circumstances. Free tuition, free books, free meals. A living memorial to the people who once called this place home." Jeremiah stared at him. "A school?" "The Amos Kane Academy. Your grandfather believed in education, in giving people the tools they needed to build better lives. What better way to honor his memory?" "And you would fund this? Pay for the construction, the teachers, the operation?" "I would endow it, enough money to run it in perpetuity. My lawyers could draw up the papers within a week." It was not what Jeremiah had expected, not what he had prepared for. But as he looked around at the ruins of Haven Springs, he could imagine children's voices filling the air where silence had reigned for 40 years. "What's the catch?" he asked. "No catch, only a condition. The story of what happened here, the real story,
becomes part of the curriculum. Students will learn about the drought, about the families who lost everything, about the choices people make when survival is at stake. They'll learn about justice and injustice, about the difference between legal and right. And about you? About what you did? About what I did, yes. All of it. I'm too old for redemption, Mr. Kane, but I'm not too old for honesty.
Jeremiah walked to the edge of the hill, looking out over the valley that had been built on the bones of his grandfather's dream. The rain had stopped completely now, and the sun was breaking through in earnest, sending steam rising from the wet earth. The families, he said finally, the ones still living. They should be consulted. Agreed. We'll track down every survivor we can find, every descendant. They'll all have a voice in how the school is run, what it teaches. And the newspaper story I sent to Denver? Let it run. Let people know what happened here, but let them also know what we're doing about it now. Jeremiah closed his eyes, trying to imagine what his grandfather would have thought of this proposal. Amos Kane had been a practical man, more interested in results than revenge. He had wanted his neighbors to prosper, their children to have opportunities he had been denied. There's one more thing, Ashford said quietly. I'd like you to stay, to help build this school, to make sure it becomes what it should be. You understand what happened here better than anyone else alive? You want me to work for you? I want you to work for them. Ashford gestured toward the cemetery on the hill. For your grandfather and all the others who deserved better than they got. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass, its liquid song clear and sweet in the clean air after the storm. Jeremiah listened to it, thinking about journeys and destinations, about justice and mercy, about the difference between what was owed and what was possible. I'll need to think about it, he said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. They rode back to town in comfortable silence, both men lost in their own thoughts. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean, the colors of the landscape sharp and vivid. By the time they reached Copper Ridge, the sun was shining fully, and people were beginning to emerge from their shelters to assess the damage and enjoy the cooler weather. Think about what I said, Ashford told him, as Jeremiah climbed down from the carriage. Think about whether revenge is really what your grandfather would have wanted. That evening, Jeremiah sat on the hotel porch with Abigail, watching the town come alive after the storm. Children splashed in the puddles that had formed in the street, and merchants swept water from their storefronts. The air was filled with the sound of renewal, of life returning to normal after the brief violence of the weather. You look different, Abigail observed. Lighter, somehow. Do I? Like a man who's set down a heavy burden. Jeremiah sipped the coffee she had brought him, considering her words. Maybe I have. Or maybe I've just picked up a different one. Sometimes that's the same thing. You're very wise for someone so young. She laughed. Ma says I'm too wise for my own good. Says it comes from listening to too many conversations that weren't meant for my ears. And what conversations have you been listening to today? The ones about you and Mr. Ashford. Folks are saying you came to some kind of understanding. We did, I think. Though I'm not sure yet what it means. Well, whatever it means, I hope it's good. For both of you. That night, Jeremiah wrote a long letter to his wife back in Denver, telling her about his journey, about what he had found, and what he had been offered. He wrote about his grandfather's grave, about the ruins of Haven Springs, about the possibility of building something new from the ashes of something old. He didn't seal the letter immediately. Instead, he left it on the small table beside his bed and tried to sleep. But sleep was elusive, his mind churning with possibilities and responsibilities he hadn't anticipated. Near midnight, he rose and walked to the window. The town was quiet now, most of its residents asleep, but lamplight still flickered in a few windows. Somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the town, lay the valley that Virgil Ashford had built from other people's dreams. And somewhere in that same darkness lay the ruins of Haven Springs, waiting for whatever future he and Ashford might create together. The next morning brought news that the Denver newspaper had decided not to run his story. The editor's telegram was brief. Insufficient verification. Old grievances of little interest to current readership. It was disappointing but not surprising. 40-year-old land disputes made poor copy compared to railroad scandals and territorial politics. But the rejection freed him to make his decision without the pressure of public scrutiny. He could choose based on what he believed was right, not on what would make the most dramatic headlines. He found Ashford waiting in the hotel lobby, hat in hand, expression carefully neutral. "I've made my decision," Jeremiah said. "And I'll help you build the school. But I have conditions of my own." "Name them." "First, the surviving families get more than just a voice in how the school is run. They get a share of the profits if the land is ever sold or developed for other purposes. Second, you endow a fund for scholarships, not just for local children, but for any child in the territory who shows promise but lacks means. Third, you put everything in writing, signed and witnessed, so there's no question about your commitments after you're gone." Ashford nodded slowly. "Reasonable conditions. Anything else?" "Yes. I want a position on the board of trustees, and I want that position to be permanent, not subject to your whims or the whims of your heirs." "Done." Ashford extended his hand. "Partners?" Jeremiah looked at the offered hand for a long moment. It was the hand of a man who had built an empire on other people's suffering, who had waited like a vulture for his neighbor's misfortune. But it was also the hand of a man who was offering to spend his remaining years trying to make amends. He took it. Partners. The handshake was firm, sealing an agreement that neither man could have imagined a week earlier. As they stood in the hotel lobby, surrounded by the ordinary bustle of a frontier town, both understood that they were committing to something larger than themselves, something that would outlast their own lives. "There's one more thing," Ashford said. "Something I didn't mention yesterday." "What's that?" "The land where we're planning to build the school. It's not legally mine to give." Jeremiah's grip tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean the original survey was wrong. The property lines were drawn incorrectly, probably deliberately. The land where Haven Springs stood, including the cemetery, was never part of my holdings. Technically, it still belongs to the families who held the original deeds." "Including my grandfather's land?" "Especially your grandfather's land. His 40 acres are right in the center of it all." Jeremiah stared at him. "You've known this all along?" "I've suspected it for years. But I had my lawyers research it after our first meeting, after I saw that deed you carry. They confirmed it yesterday." "So, what does this mean?" "It means you don't need my permission to build a school there. You have the legal right to do whatever you want with that land. But not the money to do it." "No, but I do. And I'm offering to provide it, not as the landowner trying to salve his conscience, but as someone who wants to be part of something worthwhile." The implications were staggering. Jeremiah owned the land where his grandfather had lived and died, where the community of Haven Springs had tried to take root. He could build the school himself, or sell the property, or simply let it remain ruins. The choice was entirely his. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because it's the truth. And because I think you deserve to know that you hold more cards in this game than you realized." They walked outside into the bright morning air. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving everything sharp and new. In the distance, thunder clouds were building again, promising more rain to come. "So what now?" Jeremiah asked. "Now we get to work." "I'll have my lawyers draw up the partnership agreements. You start tracking down the other families, the ones who have a stake in this, and we both start planning how to turn a bunch of ruins into a place where children can learn about the past and build a better future." As they parted ways, Jeremiah felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders, but it was a different kind of weight than he had carried for so long. Not the burden of past injustices, but the responsibility of future possibilities. He spent the rest of the day writing letters, sending telegrams, reaching out to anyone who might have connections to the families of Haven Springs. Some had died, Others had moved on and left no forwarding address. But a few responded quickly, eager to learn what had become of the place they had once called home. Within a week, the first responses began arriving. A woman in California whose parents had run the Haven Springs General Store, a man in Colorado whose brother was buried in the cemetery on the hill, a family in Kansas who still kept the deed to their old homestead in a trunk in their attic. One by one, they gave their blessing to the school project. Some even offered to contribute what they could, small amounts that wouldn't pay for much, but represented something more valuable than money: forgiveness, hope, the willingness to believe that good could come from past suffering. The legal work took months. Surveys had to be redrawn, titles clarified, agreements negotiated and signed. But by the following spring, construction began on the first building of the Amos Kane Academy. Jeremiah moved permanently to Copper Ridge, taking rooms above the general store while supervising the construction. He corresponded daily with potential teachers, ordered books and supplies, worked with architects to design buildings that would be both practical and beautiful. Ashford kept his word about the funding, but he also did something more. He began visiting the construction site regularly, not as the lord of the manor inspecting his domain, but as an old man trying to understand how to atone for the mistakes of his youth. The two men were often seen walking among the ruins, pointing at foundation stones, discussing where buildings should go and how the cemetery should be preserved and honored. They made an unlikely pair, the cattle baron and the crusader, but their partnership seemed to work. The school opened its doors in the fall of 1875, 2 years after Jeremiah had first walked into Copper Ridge with his grandfather's deed in his saddlebags. The first class was small, only 12 students ranging in age from 8 to 16, but they came from across the territory, children of ranchers and shopkeepers, miners and farmers, united by their eagerness to learn. On opening day, as Jeremiah stood before the assembled students in the main classroom, he looked out the window at the cemetery on the hill where his grandfather lay buried. The headstone was no longer alone. Other markers had been restored or replaced, creating a dignified memorial to the people who had once called this place home. "Welcome to the Amos Kane Academy," he told the children. "You are here to learn many things: reading and writing, mathematics and history, science and literature. But most importantly, you are here to learn how to build a better world than the one you inherited." One of the students, a girl of perhaps 10 with serious brown eyes, raised her hand. "Mr. Kane, what happened to the people who used to live here?" It was the question he had been expecting, the one he had spent months preparing to answer. They tried to build something good, and they faced challenges that were too big for them to handle alone. Some succeeded, some failed, and some found ways to help others succeed even when they couldn't succeed themselves. "Like your grandfather?" "Yes, like my grandfather." As the months passed, the school grew. More students arrived, drawn by the Academy's reputation for excellence and its policy of accepting anyone regardless of their ability to pay. More teachers were hired, experts in their fields who believed in the school's mission of education without discrimination. Virgil Ashford remained true to his commitment, funding not just the initial construction, but the ongoing operations, the scholarships, the expansion of programs. But his most important contribution was his willingness to speak honestly about the past, to stand before each new group of students and tell them about Haven Springs, about the drought and the displacement, about the choices he had made and their consequences. "I am not a hero," he would tell them. "I am a man who saw an opportunity and took it, without sufficient regard for those who were hurt in the process. I cannot undo what I did, but I can try to ensure that future generations have the education and the moral foundation to make better choices than I did." The students listened respectfully, some confused by his confession, others inspired by his honesty. They were learning, Jeremiah realized, not just from books and lectures, but from the living example of imperfect people trying to do better. Years passed like seasons, each one bringing new challenges and new triumphs. The school prospered beyond even Jeremiah's most optimistic expectations, its reputation spreading throughout the territory and beyond like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Students graduated and went on to become teachers and doctors, lawyers and engineers, carrying with them not just the knowledge they had learned from books and lectures, but the deeper lessons they had absorbed about justice and mercy, about the difference between what was legal and what was right, about the responsibility that came with education and opportunity. The original 12 students of that first year became the foundation upon which everything else was built. They served as examples and mentors for those who came after, demonstrating that learning was not just about memorizing facts, but about developing the capacity to think critically and act ethically. Many of them remained in touch with the school throughout their lives, returning to visit, sending letters describing their accomplishments and challenges, contributing money when they could afford it, and expertise when they couldn't. The girl with the serious brown eyes who had asked about the former residents of Haven Springs grew up to become Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of the first female physicians in the territory, who established clinics in remote areas where medical care had previously been unavailable. A boy who had arrived illiterate at the age of 14 became Professor William Thompson, who founded the mathematics department at the Territorial University and wrote textbooks that were used throughout the West. But it was not just the famous graduates who validated the school's mission. Equally important were the farmers who used their education to improve crop yields and soil conservation, the shopkeepers who treated their customers fairly regardless of race or economic status, the parents who read to their children and insisted on their education, the citizens who participated actively in democratic processes and refused to be swayed by demagogues and fearmongers. The physical plant of the school expanded to meet growing demand, but always thoughtfully, always with respect for the history of the place and the purpose it served. New dormitories were built to house students from distant parts of the territory, designed with wide porches and large windows that captured whatever breeze might stir, constructed from local stone that would weather the harsh seasons without requiring constant maintenance. A library was added in 1883, funded by donations from former students and filled with books selected not just for their educational value, but for their ability to broaden minds and challenge assumptions. The collection included works by authors of all races and nationalities, representing viewpoints that had been traditionally excluded from academic institutions. Students could read Frederick Douglass alongside Thomas Jefferson, Mary Wollstonecraft alongside John Stuart Mill, creating a dialogue across centuries and cultures that prepared them for the complex world they would inherit. A workshop was constructed where students could learn practical skills alongside their academic subjects, understanding that education should prepare them for productive work, as well as intellectual engagement. They learned carpentry and metalworking, mechanics and agriculture, gaining appreciation for the dignity of manual labor and the satisfaction that came from creating something useful with their own hands. Jeremiah married Abigail in the spring of 1878. A quiet ceremony in the school's chapel with Virgil Ashford serving as witness, a role that would have seemed impossible to imagine when the two men first met in anger and suspicion. The chapel itself was simple but beautiful, built from the same local stone as the other school buildings, with tall windows that let in the morning light and wooden pews crafted by the students themselves as part of their practical education. Wildflowers from the prairie decorated the altar, gathered by children who understood that this was not just a wedding, but a celebration of the community they were all helping to build. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher who had been educated at the academy and had returned to serve the spiritual needs of the growing settlement. His words were simple but profound, speaking of love and commitment, not just between two people, but between individuals and their community, between present and past, between the living and those who had gone before. Abigail wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit but still carrying the dignity and hope that such garments represented across generations. They raised their children on the grounds of the academy, surrounded by the ruins of the old town and the promise of the new, creating a household that served as an example of how families could thrive when education and opportunity were available to all. Their 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, grew up bilingual in English and Spanish, comfortable with students of all backgrounds, understanding from their earliest years that diversity was a strength, rather than a threat. The daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, both became teachers, carrying their father's mission to other parts of the territory where schools were desperately needed. Margaret established a school for Indian children on a reservation 200 miles north, working to preserve native languages and customs while providing the tools necessary for success in the changing world. Elizabeth founded a school for the children of Mexican immigrant workers, understanding that education was the key to integration and advancement in American society. Their son, James, became a lawyer like his grandfather Amos had once hoped to be, specializing in land rights and civil liberties, defending the poor and powerless against those who would exploit their ignorance or desperation. He established a practice that provided free legal services to anyone who could not afford representation, funded by fees collected from wealthier clients who were willing to pay extra to support justice for all. The success of these second-generation graduates proved that the Academy was not just educating individual students, but was creating a culture of service and social responsibility that would influence the territory for decades to come. Former students became community leaders who fought corruption and promoted fairness, business owners who treated their employees with dignity and paid fair wages, politicians who remembered that their power came from the people and belonged to the people. But perhaps the most significant measure of the school's success was not found in the accomplishments of its most famous graduates, but in the quiet transformations that occurred in small towns and rural communities throughout the region. Farmers who had learned to read at the Academy started lending libraries in their communities, passing books from family to family, and encouraging children to continue their education beyond the basic skills needed for survival. Former students became justices of the peace who insisted on fair trials regardless of the defendant's race or economic status, bank officers who refused to discriminate in lending practices, store owners who treated all customers with equal respect. The ripple effects extended far beyond education itself. The Academy's emphasis on critical thinking and ethical reasoning began to influence political discourse throughout the territory, raising the level of debate and making it more difficult for demagogues and fearmongers to manipulate public opinion. Graduates became journalists who insisted on accuracy and fairness in reporting, judges who applied the law equally to rich and poor, legislators who based their decisions on evidence rather than prejudice. By the 1890s, the territory was widely regarded as one of the most progressive regions in the American West, with literacy rates higher than the national average, lower levels of racial violence than other frontier areas, and economic policies that promoted opportunity for all rather than privilege for the few. Visitors from other states often commented on the unusual atmosphere of tolerance and cooperation they encountered, not realizing that these qualities had been systematically cultivated through decades of educational effort that began in the ruins of a forgotten town. Ashford died in 1882, leaving his entire fortune to the school. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former students and faculty, ranchers and townspeople who had known him as both tyrant and benefactor. He was buried not in the elaborate family plot he had prepared years earlier, but in the simple cemetery on the hill near the grave of Amos Kane. The inscription on his headstone was one he had written himself. He learned too late the cost of taking what was not freely given. Jeremiah lived to see the 20th century, watching his school grow into one of the finest educational institutions in the American West. When he died in 1904, he was mourned by thousands of former students who remembered him not as the man who had come seeking vengeance for ancient wrongs, but as the teacher who had shown them how to build something good from the ashes of something broken. The Amos Kane Academy still stands today, its buildings weathered by time, but its mission unchanged. In the main hall hangs a portrait of the school's founder, a stern-faced man with kind eyes who understood that justice is not always about punishment, but sometimes about the harder work of redemption and renewal. And on the hill above the school, in the cemetery where the people of Haven Springs lie buried, visitors can still find two graves side by side: Amos Kane, who stood when others fell, and Virgil Ashford, who learned in the end to stand as well.